Hi, this is Keith Wooden, and welcome to Story Mosaics. Joining us today is Justin White, and I'm so excited about having him with us. He and I have spoken a couple of times on the phone, but this is our first time to meet, right, Justin?
First times face to face. Good to see you,
this
Keith.
this is it. This is it. So I'm so glad to have you with us. But Justin is one of the pastors at Mount Gilead Church in Mooresville, Indiana, or near Mooresville, Indiana. And again, I want to remind you, how do I find people to come on and tell their stories? And this came from a friend of mine, and when she told me his story, and then when I got to hear his story, it was just fascinating. And I asked Justin in his preparation, I asked him just to do me a favor rather than kind of trying to tell his life story. I asked him to kind of take a pen and press it in the timeline of the events of his life there and tell us a story of that moment in his life. And so, Justin, I'm going to let you just stick that pen in the timeline and tell us a story from your life.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, when you asked me that question, I immediately went to this scene from July 26th of 2015, and the days immediately after that. July 26, 2015, I overdosed on heroin and fentanyl. 4 days later, I found myself in the back of my parents' vehicle. They were driving me up to Minnesota, a place called Hazelden Betty Ford. It's a treatment center. Um, in that moment, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't understand addiction. This was all new to us. We didn't have drugs or alcohol present growing up. My dad was a preacher. He just never drank, even a glass of wine. What wasn't a part of our family's um, practice. And so for me to be at a place where I had just overdosed on heroin and fentanyl, like we didn't know what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I did know that was the moment, the very first moment I finally said, you know what, maybe I've got a problem. Maybe I need some help. And I know that's crazy to think it took
Yeah.
an overdose on heroin and fentanyl for me to wake up and to admit I had a problem, but that's what it took. And so
Yeah.
I'm in the back seat of my parents' car, and you can just imagine that 12-hour road trip. I was being crushed by guilt and shame. I had no idea what this was going to mean for my life. I thought I was all alone. I thought I was the world's biggest loser. I was a preacher and had got caught up in this addiction, and I didn't know. I didn't know what the future was going to hold. I was just really confused. I get up to the treatment center, and right before we get out of the car, I tell my parents, I said, I can't imagine my life without drugs. And in that moment, I couldn't. I
Wow.
thought I was just going to be sick and kind of having to just go through life handicapped and without a sense of joy. Those drugs had robbed me of joy and peace and happiness and a whole bunch of other things. I couldn't imagine even the possibility of getting better. So I said that to my parents. We walk into the treatment center and we're just sort of waiting there in the lobby. And there's some paperwork we had to fill out before I could begin treatment. I knew my parents were just minutes away from leaving and going back home, and I'd be up there all by myself,
Wow.
without my family, without my friends. And I'm just sitting there trying to process everything. And then all of a sudden, as I'm waiting there in that moment, filled with grief and guilt and shame and confusion, all of a sudden I hear laughing. And I look
Wow.
up, and finally, the laughing got closer and closer. And I realized that laughing was coming from a group of guys. Now, later, I find out they were just passing the lobby where I was sitting on their way to the cafeteria for lunch, right? But I watched them, and they were laughing, they were joking around, kind of horsing around like guys do.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, how in the world could these guys be laughing? Like they're
Especially
they're
in a place like that.
in a place
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
like they're here probably for the same reason I am. They're
That's right.
either an addict or an alcoholic, and they were desperate and they needed help. How could you be laughing? And then it hit me. maybe this thing works.
Wow.
Maybe, maybe if they're at a place where they can laugh, maybe I can get there too. And Keith, I was able to get there and I was able to rebuild, but that was the first moment I had a little bit of hope that maybe something good could come out of this.
Wow. Birth of hope in that moment of laughter as they walked by.
Yeah.
Justin, that is just such a great picture. I have to ask you a couple of questions about that. A few of those moments along the way. You talked about driving up there with your parents. Was there anger within you as well? What were some of the other emotions that were attendant? Because you mentioned the guilt and the shame, and certainly we want to come back and visit those because those are two of the most powerful, powerful emotions. Um, but was there anger? Were you angry at them, or was it just you just wanted to hide, or what were the emotions that were you going through your mind at that moment?
Hiding was a big part of it. Hiding was a big part of the story even before that moment, right?
Yeah,
And my story is a little bit different in that I started in my addiction just with a prescription from my doctor. I had gone to him because I was having some headaches and needed some help. They're sort of migraine style, and he gave me a couple medications. One of them was hydrocodone
yeah,
or
yeah,
Vicodin. And I had always kind of I had been on hydrocodone before for a couple minor procedures, and honestly, always kind of liked the way they made me feel. But this time was different. This time, when I took those first couple of pills, like I wanted the whole bottle,
wow,
and that's basically what I did. I ended up taking the whole bottle much sooner than I needed to, and then would call in, get another script, call in and get another script, give it up the dosage along the way. And by the way, my doctor is not to blame for this. This is my recovery. This is my
that's right,
life.
that's
But
right.
that's part of what happened. That was part of the story. And so when I was put on that medication and found myself hooked to hooked to those pain pills, I was a preacher. I was a well-known figure in my community. I was a husband. I was a dad of three kids. Um, and so as the addiction developed, I had to mask everything. I had to
Yes,
hide. I had to people please, just to keep going with life,
yeah,
right? And then certainly when I overdosed, I had to hide because I didn't know what was going on. I didn't really understand at that point addiction. You mentioned anger. I can't say that anger was really much a part
yeah.
of it.
Okay,
Really, just because I knew that I had caused something that became a great disruptor, not only in my life but in the lives of the
yes,
people around me, my immediate family, my extended family, my circle of friends, my church,
wow,
who now had a pastor who is a heroin addict. I mean, that's kind of crazy. You don't hear about that every day. I think I think it was just a great sense of loss, and I felt like I
wow,
had let the whole world down. I was embarrassed,
yes.
um, and 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 really struggled seeing any kind of light or hope. Now, I will say this: one thing that happened on my way up there was that I had a friend call me, and this was a friend I had known for a few years. He called me. He heard a little bit about what was going on. He didn't know the full story, but he had called my wife, and she told him, "Yeah, you probably need to call him. He's gotten into some things kind of over his head." Well, he called me, and in the midst of that conversation, he told me, "Hey, listen, a few years ago, I was struggling with alcohol, and I had to go to get treatment as well." And Keith, this was a guy I thought had everything together in his
Yes.
life.
Yes.
I never would have guessed that he was somebody that struggled with alcohol. But he shared that with me, and it was the first time I realized the power of connection in
Mm.
recovery. And that first phone call was huge to me. Now, I wasn't at the point where I thought I could get better, right? That
Yes.
came
Yes.
later. But the fact that he reached out and said, "You know what? I've had this problem too," it was so massive, so powerful.
We forget, and here's what I would sense out of that conversation is that your friend got a prompting. Something just urged him to call you. Now, we can do several things with those promptings. We
Yeah.
can squelch them and suppress them, or we can test them and act on them.
Yes.
And you know what? I if he had not, that I'm not saying that that one call changed the course, but it set in motion a connection that you were not isolated. And
That's
I'm
right.
sure you were feeling isolated, especially on that drive up. And with it being so far away, I mean, you're not going down to the hospital down the street. You're going, you know, like I think you said, 12 hours away
Yes.
to a place to get the treatment.
Yep.
Um, that's amazing. That's amazing. You know, we you talk about this hiding and the guilt and the shame, and I want to just unpack that just a little bit
Okay.
because um, one of the things that we see from the history of our um, by understanding of Scripture is that the first reaction that Adam and Eve had was to hide, and it was a result of these two very strong, compelling elements of guilt and shame.
Yes.
Can you help us understand a little bit? Can you diagram, if you will, or help give us a picture of what guilt and shame and what's the difference between those two? Do you understand what I'm asking?
It's a great question, Keith. Here's how we describe that in our recovery ministry. We say there is a big difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says I did something wrong.
Okay.
Shame is I am wrong, right?
Wow. Oh,
We
we
feel like in the midst
yes.
of our problems, our sins, our mistakes, we feel like I'm a problem.
Uh-huh.
I'm dirty, right? But that's really the evil one messing with us a little bit.
Sure is.
The truth is you are not wrong. It's your actions that are wrong.
Yes.
You can be redeemable. If you are in Christ, you are a redeemed person, right? That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you didn't do something that you shouldn't have, that needs to be corrected or even repented of.
Um,
But there is
let
a big difference.
Yeah, let me grab a hold of those because I
Yep.
think others need to hear that. Guilt, I did something. Shame, I am. And, it's really interesting when you think about that because the I am statements, those identity statements, our ultimate thoughts of who
Yes.
we are. And all of our recovery, the Bible says in Romans 12:2 that we renew our minds. And
Yes. Romans
all
12.
yeah, and no matter how we look at it, all of our renewal starts first in our mind, then touches the rest of our being, touches our emotions, and then ultimately touches our actions. If we get stuck in the guilt, and I think a lot of people get stuck in the guilt. They just go around circle, circle, circle. I did something bad. I did something bad. I did something bad, and they don't understand that there was a thought behind this that I am, and it may even go beyond the circle of that addiction to really the manifestation of your personal identity of who you are and never having the light bulb turn on. And so if you were to let's just try something, Justin. This may fall flat on its face. I'm okay with those kind of moments, okay? But if you were to look back in that moment, what would you say the I am statement that you had, even going into the addiction? Because you were in ministry, and ministry, oh man, it's a crucible of weight. And most people look at pastors. I remember when I married my wife and I was already a pastor then, and she said, "Oh, all my life I've prayed that I would get to marry a pastor." And I said, "Well, that'll change."
Be careful what you pray for.
Yes, for sure. That'll change because it's a crucible like most people do not understand. What were some of the I am statements that you were kind of rehearsing in your mind
Yeah.
um, eh, during that time frame, even before the addiction?
Right. So I have a deeper problem, and that's the people pleasing problem,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah.
So you talk about I am statements. Like for me, maybe an I am statement would be I am not what you think I am.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
You feel me? So
yeah.
I grew up a pastor's kid, and regardless of maybe strides we've made in churches. There is a greater spotlight on the preacher and his family, and wanting to make sure that there's a higher bar set for behavior and
Yeah.
actions and how you speak and how you dress, all that stuff, right? And some of that is probably brought on by ourselves.
Yeah.
That's a mind game you have to kind of work through. Well, so I grew up a pastor's kid, and then immediately after going to college and getting my degree, ended up in the largest church in our town. Served there for 10 years as children's minister, and then a preacher there, and then moved to Columbus, where I ended up developing my addiction. I was a preacher there in one of the larger churches, and so there was always sort of this um, glass house that we were living in,
Yeah.
where there were some expectations put on me and my family, and that's nobody to blame. It's just the
No.
way it is, right?
No.
And so there came a point where I feel like the the trying to meet people's expectations
Yeah.
became
Yes.
crushing,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And there had to be some release valve. Now, I should have found release valve in an authentic small group, or maybe with a
Wow.
mentor, maybe even little things like uh, exercise routines,
Sure.
right? Where you can
Sure.
healthy releases to life. Um, but for me, there came a point where when I took those pills, I felt like I could be me. I felt this sense of warmth and this sense of release and freedom. Now, some people, when they take narcotic drugs, they don't have that feeling at all,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But for some of us, we do. And then, of course, when I took those drugs and I felt that release and I felt like I could be me without anybody's expectations or judging, I wanted more of that, right?
Yes.
And then as I wanted more and more, that's how the addiction began.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Yeah.
I was at a place where I just felt like I was trying to be somebody I was not. I was
Yeah.
trying to convey this idea that I didn't have problems. I kind of had this perfect life, which nobody does. I was lying to myself,
That's right.
right? But I will tell you, Keith, I want to share this too. Even after I came home from rehab, I still hadn't figured this out. I didn't really openly share this with my church. The elders where I was serving, they knew I had gone away, and they even helped me get to treatment. They were super supportive. I'm so thankful for them, and even had me
Yes.
come back and start preaching. But I never really shared with the congregation in some massive announcement, hey, I developed this addiction. I had to go to treatment. I appreciate your support. We didn't do that. I would drive. I tell my friends in recovery this all the time. I would drive like 20 or 30 minutes away from my home to go to an AA or NA or Celebrate Recovery meeting, because I was so scared that I might run into somebody in my town at a
Yes.
meeting and they would know, oh, he's got some problems. Like
Wow.
I still didn't get it. It took
Yeah.
me
Yeah. That
years.
it's it's so interesting, Justin, because like you said, you still didn't get it at that
Still didn't
point
get it.
that that hiding still, even hiding in plain sight, if you
That's
will.
right.
And you I want to go back and capture that first early statement, because then I want you to continue with this, because you had this image that I am what you think of me. It was what, so again, you're still living in that even after your recovery. But and you mentioned another thing that's so important, Justin, because you're talking about one area of addiction, and there are a lot of us, a lot of us who share in this circle of addictions that's very, very large, very, very, very large. We share in this circle of addictions, and we think, oh, I'm not addicted to that, and that gets me off the hook. But there are so many things that we run to, that we
Yes.
seek out for comfort,
Yes.
for solace, for some kind of um, escape.
Escape.
Yeah.
Massive. Yep.
and and those and so I want all of us, and one of the things, I know I'm stepping way ahead, Justin, but one of the things you said about your connections group, and that's your recovery group is called Connections.
We call it Connections. Yep.
I love that because it speaks of the very essence of what we need is that connection. But one of the things you said about that is you have people coming through the doors of Connections from all walks of life. And there might be some that would say, "Oh, that's not an addiction." Yes, it is. To that person who's going through this, they understand their addictions. And so, um, thank you for casting that net very wide and broad for us to understand what our addictions are. So,
Oh, I appreciate that, Keith. We just sort of operate around here at our church that everybody's in recovery. We're all in
thank you,
recovery. And
thank you.
honestly, we steal a phrase from Celebrate Recovery. Celebrate Recovery uses the phrase hurts, habits, and hangups,
Yeah,
right? You probably heard that before. It's a great phrase, and that's we just sort of double down on that. So
that's right.
in the recovery world, there are two types of meetings typically. There's closed meeting, where a closed meeting is you have to be an addict or an alcoholic to attend, right? But then there's open meetings. Open meetings is what it sounds like. It's open to anybody. Our meeting is an open meeting. Now, we didn't start that way. I'll just tell a quick story. So um, when we started attending here at Mount Gilead on the southwest side of Indianapolis, after a few weeks, my pastor, his name is Jeff Fall, he came to me and he had followed the story. He knew what had happened. And he said, Justin, our county, our town we're just getting crushed by addiction.
Wow.
And we as a church, we want to do something about it. He said, I know that you've had some experience with this. And what do you think about starting a little support group? And I was honored. I was thankful for the opportunity. I need my own recovery group,
Yeah.
and I was looking for my own connection and support group. And so I said, sure, we'll do it. So we made a little announcement at church. Hey, everybody, we're going to have an addiction support group. It's going to be at Monday night, 7 o'clock. Would love to have you. The very first meeting, 5 people showed up. No addicts and no alcoholics. You know who showed up? It was the family members.
Oh,
It was
wow.
the spouses of, let's say, an alcoholic.
Okay,
It
okay.
was the parents of a grown child who had developed an addiction. And they came in that night and they were hurting and they were angry. You talk about anger earlier on. I mean, these people were angry. Like this whole thing, this addiction thing had entered their home, not of their own doing, but from a loved one, and
Yeah.
had totally wrecked their lives and upended them. And I learned in that moment that they had their own things to work through. They had been
Uh,
wounded. They had developed their own problems and issues and emotions, and they just wanted somebody to listen. And so we just
yes.
started meeting and sharing stories together and listening to one another, building trust around the room. A couple months in, I went back to Jeff and I said, Jeff, I appreciate this opportunity, but this is not what I had in mind at all. Like, I'm an addict. I'd had to go through the legal system as well, incarceration, because of the addiction, which I don't know if we want to talk about that at some point as well. Um, and so I could speak to somebody who was dealing with those things, but I didn't know what I was doing with these family members,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
He
yeah.
said, I mean, it's true. He said, Justin, just stick with it. He said, I think this is going to work. He said, in fact, in a few weeks, I'm going to do a sermon series, a 4-week sermon series on mental health. One on loneliness, one on depression, one on anxiety, and one on addiction. When you get to the one on addiction, or when we get to the one on addiction, why don't you get up and just tell your story? Just come on out. We won't have a sermon that day. You share your story. And I did, talked about the addiction, the overdose, the legal issues, all of it. Well, the next Monday night, after that Sunday morning when I gave that testimony, we went from 5 people to 20 people, just like that,
Just like that.
because it just cracked the ice. And people thought, oh, if he can get up there and talk about it, maybe I can talk about it too. And I just share that with you just to kind of paint the picture of what happened when we when we opened the doors to
That's
other
right.
people
There you go.
other than the addict and the alcoholic. It made our group better. It made our
That's
group
right.
stronger. And then we start to realize we're all in the same boat together. We, there's there are some minor differences in our stories,
That's
but
right.
pretty much our stories are all the same. That
Yeah,
we're
they
broken, we are wounded,
there you go.
we have scars, we have some insecurities, and we need help in order to overcome it. We learn that, of course, there is somebody that can help us do what we cannot do for ourselves, and
Yes.
that's how the meeting began.
Oh, that's amazing. And can we just celebrate just for a moment? Because Pastor Jeff said, I'm going to bring this into the light.
Yep.
And the moment we bring things into the light,
Oh
they
man,
lose their power. You know,
it's totally disarmed.
it's totally disarmed. While it's in the darkness,
Yep.
we are in the chains. But and I don't know who's listening ever. Okay, I have people actually all over the world, and there's people, in different spots that are listening, and there's several pastors that listen in. And you know what? Shame keeps us in the dark.
Yes.
Shame is what makes us want to hide. And so we're coming back to this idea of whatever we bring into the light loses its shame and gives us the opportunity. And Pastor Jeff, in tremendous wisdom, said, I'm not going to let you hide, Justin.
He didn't.
We're not gonna hide here. We're gonna make sure that we bring this out. What a powerful, powerful, powerful
Well,
moment.
and that's a great statement, Keith. I appreciate you saying that. And you're exactly right. We just doubled down on that. Once we saw what
Yeah,
happened 6 years ago when we started, and we went from 5 people to 20 people. And by the way, fast forward to today, we're the largest faith-based recovery meeting in the state. There's like anywhere between 150 and 200 people that show up at our church every Monday night here in the country uh, for help and recovery.
uh-huh.
And what we've learned is exactly what you just said. We think that if people knew the real me, if people knew really what was happening on the inside, the things I was thinking or the things that I've done, that people would reject me. What we find is that when we really open up and are transparent, authentic, our authentic selves,
That's right.
people don't reject us. We actually get closer together.
Yes.
It connects us. It's unbelievable. Um, I'll tell you who taught me this early on is when I would go to these meetings, small meetings, faith-based recovery meetings, and some guys would walk over from work release. They'd been incarcerated, and they were some of the most honest, authentic
That's
people
right.
I'd ever
That's
been around.
right. Uh-huh.
And I'm like, how can you be so honest about yourself? Like they modeled that for me.
They did.
Those first guys that I met at rehab, I was in a unit with about 30 guys, and we would go to lessons 2 or 3 times a day, and then we'd come back to the unit and get in a circle and just do a little bit of a process together, a sharing of what we learned. And I would hear these guys when I went to rehab say, "Hey, my name's Bob, and I'm an alcoholic. My name's Nick, and I'm an addict." And they would share these like personal reflections from their past or stories, of hurt or their own pain or their own things that they had done wrong, mistakes, sins. And I'm just sitting there, those first few days of rehab, and I can't even say anything. I'm so blown away by the authenticity.
Yeah.
And I remember when I came back home from rehab, I started meeting one on one and did some therapy, some counseling. And I shared all of that with him. And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, Justin, can you imagine if the church got that?
That's right. Oh man.
Oh, so just be honest, like that's been one of my goals ever since rehab.
That's
Like,
right.
what can we learn from the recovery community as far as authenticity and honesty and full surrender and just being ourselves in the context of community? What could that do? And I think we're seeing that play out in our church in a really special way.
I think so. Mount Gilead has understood the essence of, and I've never been to the church, but they've understood the essence of that. I have the privilege of going down and speaking to a group of guys that have come out of incarceration. They meet at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and they have different people who come and speak. I absolutely enjoy that group of guys. sometimes there's just a handful of us. I don't really care how many, it doesn't matter to me whether it's 550 or 500 or 5,000.
Yeah,
But in that moment, everything's stripped away because there's
that's
no
right.
there's that they're sitting there going, listen, I've done some really bad things, and if Christ is able to reach me, then he's able to reach any man in this room.
Yes.
It's a group of guys that were incarcerated, so that's a powerful moment. We had a phrase. I've retired from ministry now, but we had a phrase that we opened every service with that simply said, no matter who you are, where you've been, or what you've done, because of what Christ has done, you're welcome here.
Praise God. Love
That's
that, man.
it's a really dangerous statement because it took us almost 3 to 5 years. I can't, mark it on a timeline, but it took us about 3 to 5 years before the community believed it because
Yes.
they're so used to churches putting on airs and judging and things like that. And when you say, no matter who you are, where you've been, or what you've done, you're welcome here, you've opened the doors and not just cracked them. You've opened the doors. And this sounds really terrible in one sense, but the ugliness of our hurts comes through the doors. But that's the only place, the only way it has a chance to be redeemed and recovered. And
That's exactly right.
Justin, when I look at your life and what God has done through it, what a redemption story! What a tale of what God is able to do. Um, when did you start? Did you start calling it connections right from the very beginning?
We did. And I'll tell you why we did that. That counselor that I was talking about just a second ago,
Uh huh.
he said something else that to me was profound. Um, he said, Justin, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. We kind of think that's what the opposite of addiction is, just getting clean, right?
That's
He
right.
said, no, the opposite of addiction is connection. And that when he said that, it was like, mic drop, blew my mind. Yeah.
Yes.
And I had to really think about that. And I will tell you, even to this day, I'm still processing that. But I think he's right. Um, I believe he's right that in our brokenness, one of the things that happens, whether it's an addiction or some compulsive sin or dysfunctional behavior, all of that leads to isolation,
That's right.
right? And that's a great tool of the evil one to isolate us. That isolation leads to shame. Okay, thinking that there's some that I'm wrong. I'm a bad person in and of myself. Isolation leads to all kinds of things. But when we start connecting in authentic community with other people and in an authentic relationship with the Lord, that connection leads to health, right? And so from the very
Yeah.
beginning,
Yes.
as the meeting started to develop, we said, okay, we're gonna latch on to that phrase. We're gonna be connections.
I love that. And one of the things you've used repeatedly here, so I want to go back and make sure that those who are listening understand this. You've used the term authentic. Um, and here's the weird thing is, you get something from the store and it says, that this product is authentic, and then you turn it over and you read the contents. There's no chicken in there, and that's the issue here sometimes is we talk about authenticity and then we look at the back of the package and maybe that's not what we understand. So can we go back and visit what authenticity feels like? I want you to describe maybe even the first time you were able to be authentic. What is authenticity feel like? What does it look like? And um, what happens on the face of an individual? I know I've thrown three things at you really quickly here, Justin, but when you see a person for the very first time be authentic, what's the feeling? Because you've been there where you finally got to be authentic. Tell me a little bit about that.
I think the first emotion is absolute brokenness.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank
Here's
you.
what I mean. I'll give you a story as an illustration. few weeks ago on Monday night at our meeting, I saw this young guy come in. First time, he looked really down. He looked depressed. Wasn't saying much. At our break, he came up to me, and some of the guys that show up here have to come. They're mandated by the court system, right?
Yes.
So he had a piece of paper that he wanted me to sign and fill out that he had come to the meeting. And so I did. And after I did that, I said, "How you doing?" And he said, "Well, to be honest with you, I don't feel very comfortable here right now."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, just want you to know, man, you're welcome here. We're all a bunch of people just trying to get healthy. This is a safe place for you." And then he said, "No, you don't understand. I don't feel well. I don't feel comfortable here in this building." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" Well, and then he rolled up his sleeve and he had a picture of Satan tattooed on his arm. And here he is in a church building. No wonder he didn't feel very comfortable. And I said, "Man, listen, there's a different life that you can have. And I don't really care what you have tattooed on your body. Like, you're welcome here."
Thank you,
And
Justin.
Keith, he came into me and he latched onto me and he starts sobbing.
Yes,
Okay. That's authenticity.
that is.
When you come to this place, like what he had done for I don't know how many years of his life, I'm still getting to know him and his story. But he had built this narrative about himself and about his life. We all do this, by the way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
may not have had Satan tattooed on my arm, but I built up this story about myself for years, right? And thought I had to be a certain way or think a certain way or talk a certain way in order to get people's approval. He had done the same way, but it had led him to some very evil things, right?
Yes.
Once he found himself in a place where he was accepted for him, it's first of all just absolute brokenness. He was at the end of himself,
That's right.
sobbing, right? Well, then that's where you can build, right? In that moment, I was so excited for him because I knew something was coming. And what I watched the rest of the night was other men that he started connecting with
Yes.
pour into him, pray with
Yes.
him, hug him, spend time with him. You know what that guy has done? He has not missed a Monday night meeting,
No. No.
and then he's been
Yeah.
texting me this week. Here it is, almost Easter Sunday. And he's asking me about service time so he can come to our church and worship Christ, right? Like, this is crazy, right? But this is what happens when authenticity strikes.
That's right. Yeah, Justin, I'm an emotional guy. Okay. So if you see the tears in my eyes, because those breakthrough moments
Yeah.
are so incredible.
Well, they
And
keep you going.
oh, and all of a sudden, so many of these are replaying in my mind of how many times I've just opened my arms and somebody has fallen into them in
Yes.
brokenness and
Broken.
the freedom that they experienced. And I go back to your initial story and I think that you thought for the longest time that you didn't know who you would be without the joy that the drugs brought you.
That's right.
And then all of a sudden you fall into the arms of freedom and you recognize this is what Christ is. That's
That's
the
right.
kind of freedom. Oh, that's and okay. I'm kind of watching our time and trying to be careful on time as well. But I've got at least to talk about one other area here, and that's uh, first of all, I wrote down notes from the things we talked about the other day, and I got my notes here. And one of the things that you had said was the opposite of, and so I appreciate that the opposite of addiction is not not
Sobriety.
sobriety. Thank you. It's connection.
Yep.
It's connectivity. The other thing you said, and I've heard this several different times, Justin, is that we come out of trauma and that addictions are find their root in trauma. And so naturally people go back to when they think of trauma, they think, oh, it must be something massive. It must be
Mm.
something that like uh, it could be abuse. That could be the trauma. but it can also be something of a subtle message that we've started to believe, and that has become something that has changed our identity from who Christ
So good.
and how we were created. I look back at that Jeremiah 29:11, which says, I know exactly who you are.
Mm-hmm.
I know the plans I have for you. I look at the Psalm 139, who says, I fashioned you, I created you, I know you. But trauma reshapes us, and it can just be the message of you'll never measure up, and that can be trauma, or
Yes.
uh,
Yeah,
or this.
especially if that's on repeat for years, even
Yes,
decades
yes,
of your life. That's an excellent point. Yes.
yeah,
That in and of itself is a form of trauma.
yes, and so, you know, whenever I heard this conversation of trauma, I couldn't relate to it. I did have a trauma in my life that was a big one, but you know what? Because of my family gathering around in that moment, especially my dad, who became my defender and my earthly savior in that moment, it didn't take root as a trauma. But there were phrases that were used, not in my family, but in my friendships, that created a trauma in my life. And all of a sudden, when I put my finger on those, I go, wow, I never considered that, because it didn't seem like very big, but it was one phrase that was, like you said, on repeat, that created the trauma. So I want people to listen and hear that trauma takes many, many different forms. And obviously this guy who had the tattoo had a trauma, but you know what? It may not have been what he thought it was,
That's right.
so wow, that's so. Explain to me some of the ways that you see trauma manifest itself, and how connection again, and the group connections is the bridge out of that trauma and out of the addictions. Then,
Sure. Well, I think, especially in this day age, you think about social media and you think
oh
about the
wow,
lies that
thank
are
you.
just inundating especially our children. Social media is just a reflection of other kinds of problems that we've had in our culture and our country for many, many years,
Yes,
right? These lies that you have to be a certain way, or you're not good enough, or you're not included, right? Those are lies that are only increasing in our culture. Where you
that's
think
right.
even politically, what's happening with this narrative that we're just all enemies all of a sudden,
Oh
right?
wow, yes,
And that just leads to like a mental chaos, and it's hard to process all of that, right?
yes,
And so what we try to do, like on Monday night, is in fact, a lot of times I just say, guys, you may be coming here because of an addiction, you may be coming because of a wound or a relationship. I don't really care why you're coming. I'm just glad you're here.
that's
And
right.
and like we're just a melting pot. I shared that with another counselor, a friend of mine recently, and he's because I was processing with him like, hey, this has become much more than just a 12-step meeting. Like this has
Yes,
become almost like a church inside of a church.
it is.
And I'm like, Gary, that's my counselor friend's name. I said, Gary, help me understand what am I supposed to do? There's no blueprint really for something like this that has happened. And he said, Justin, you realize what you're doing is more than a recovery meeting. And he used this phrase. He said, what you've created is a magnet for belonging. A magnet for belonging. And I love that phrase, and I think he's right.
Oh,
That we have people
absolutely.
showing up on Monday night that don't have addictions, that really don't have a ton of trauma in their life, but
That's
they
right.
are trying to process something, and they just like to be in an environment where there are
That's right.
other people on that same journey, willing to say, you know what, I got some problems I'm working on, I got some things I need to think through, and want to be in that environment. And so what we just see is the more that you can foster acceptance and belonging. And we don't care why you're here. We don't really care what you've done.
Yeah,
We're just here. We're a group of people trying to get healthy.
that's
That's all
right.
we are. We're just a group trying to get healthy. And that is an antidote
That's right.
to overcoming trauma and dysfunction. That alone.
That's right. And Justin, I was so glad. The other phrase that I had written down in my notes was belonging.
Yeah.
And so I want you to repeat that, because I think again, at least at least my mind, there's two ways I absorb things. One is through repetition, and especially in a podcast, because people are listening to this in the car, they're listening to this while they're doing the dishes, they're listening to it while they're distracted, and sometimes those moments come and they go, oh, what was that, what was that, and they're not willing to go back and listen to the whole thing, but they are willing to grab it again if we'll repeat it. So the antidote, help me out with that phrase again, that Gary was speaking of there.
Yeah, the antidote to trauma and dysfunction is to find yourself in a community of belonging. He says we have created, and the Lord has done a work in creating something through us that has become a magnet for belonging. And this goes into something I just want to say real quick. I
You're
just
fine. You're fine.
believe what's happening at our church. Um, I believe it can happen in any church
Thank
that
you.
really wants to make a difference in their communities to address this situation. In fact, we part of our vision now that we've seen what God has done here is we want to take what we've learned. Not that we're perfect, we make mistakes all the time, but we've learned some things along the way that we want to share what we've done and what the Lord has done through us, and share that with other churches who might be interested in creating a similar kind of ministry. Keith, I believe if churches are not investing in a group like this or in a ministry like this in some way, shape, or form, they're missing an amazing opportunity
That's right.
to get people to Jesus. Because here's now how we operate. Our church's vision statement is to help people become lifelong disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's why we exist as a church. But it dawned on me as our meeting started to grow, look, these people can't become lifelong disciples of Jesus if they're waking up dope sick every morning, if they stay
Wow.
stuck in that
Yeah.
toxic relationship, if they are still crushed by that wound from 20, 30, 40 years ago, if they wake up hungover every morning, how can we get them to become lifelong disciples of Jesus?
Right.
So there has to be a step in which people come in. Maybe they don't know about Jesus at all. Maybe they're really far away from a relationship with the Lord, but they know they've got a problem and they need some help, and they want some people to help them get through their problems. And so they come in to our meeting, and we welcome them in on Monday nights. And it's not bait and switch. It's
No.
not that we're trying to do is get people in the baptistry. That's not it. That's part of it, right? I
Yes.
want somebody to get to Jesus, okay?
Amen.
But I
Yes.
also understand they cannot get there unless we first of all help them with whatever
That's right.
trauma or
Yeah.
dysfunction or addiction
Yeah.
that they may be dealing with. And so I always tell them, one of the first things I tell new folks when they come to our meeting is I say, look, you don't have a drug problem, you don't have a drinking problem, you have a me problem, and I have a me problem. And so let's attack that. Let's get to the
Yeah.
roots of our problems so that those limitations and obstacles to Jesus are thrown out, and
That's
we
right.
can get you into a healthy, solid, stable foundation, maybe for the first time in your life.
Oh, Justin, that is right on target. And um, I want to emphasize that this is a humbling thing, but you're absolutely right when you say you don't have a corner on this. You just have a commitment to it.
It's
And
good.
as other people would say, you know what? We are ready to not wear masks when we walk through the doors at 10:30 or 11 a.m. We're going to be authentic in everything. And we
That's
have
right.
to have pastors like Jeff who step forward and say, hey, guess what? Bunch of broken people here, and we want to be transparent and authentic with one another. Um,
Yes.
Justin, can I have the freedom just to put your email address or a contact information, or should they just maybe get in touch through Mount Gilead? Because I think you're going to find through this there might be others who say, "I would like to come to the group to see it so that we can franchise it, if you will."
Oh,
Fran-
absolutely. That's exactly what we're talking about. Just helping people with a model. Churches, a
yes,
lot of churches want to do something like this.
that's right.
They just don't know how to get started, and we can help with that.
That's
In
absolutely
fact, I might
right.
just mention this too. Of course, we have a website for our church, but we also now have a website just dedicated to our recovery ministry at our church. It's real
Awesome.
easy to remember. It's just recovery.mgchurch.org. And you can get a
Okay.
little idea of what we do. There's even a welcome video, kind of what to expect when you come. There are all of our past lessons and tons of resources for the state of Indiana that we've compiled in one place as a resource hub for anybody that might be interested.
And for those who are listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, I'll put that in the bottom third here so that you can make sure that you access this, and we'll put a quick link to it as well, so you can get to it right away. And one more excuse to watch this on YouTube. But Justin, this has been so refreshing, and I think what you've done here too is you've cast a vision because of your authenticity, your transparency. You've cast a vision for some people who are stuck and they've been playing the game, they've been hiding in shame, and now is their first step towards saying, I'm going to break that.
Yes.
And I can find renewal, and they will hear the laughter of that person that's walking by,
Amen.
maybe for the first time, that you, when you didn't think there could be laughter, there's a bunch of people laughing in a place like that in Minnesota. They will hear laughter for the very first time with new vision.
Perfect.
Justin, I can't thank you enough for coming and being a part of Story Mosaics. Story Mosaics has as its essence and its mission the fact that every one of us has a story, and we just want to tell those stories, because in telling our stories, even as you told your stories here, Justin, 1,000 others have entered my mind, of stories from my own life, and they bring healing and hope to people. And we just want to bring that, as we share our stories with one another. So I want to thank everybody who joined us on Story Mosaics today, and thank you for being a part of this.